Imagine, for a moment, that you could stand at the very edge of existence itself, in the silence before silence had a name, in the darkness before darkness had anything to be dark about. Now ask yourself the question that has haunted physicists, priests, and philosophers alike for as long as human beings have looked up at the night sky and wondered why there is something rather than nothing. What was there before the beginning of the universe? It sounds like a simple question. It is not. In fact, it may be one of the most dangerous questions a mind can ask, because the moment you try to answer it, you discover that the question itself might be broken, built on an assumption that does not survive contact with reality, and that discovery, strange as it sounds, was something C.S. Lewis wrestled with long before most modern cosmologists took it seriously. Here is a fact that tends to stop people in their tracks. Augustine of Hippo, writing 16 centuries ago, was once asked what God was doing before he created the universe. His answer was not evasive. He said that time itself was part of creation, that there was no before, in the way we imagine it, because before implies a clock ticking, and there was no clock. Lewis, centuries later, picked up this exact thread. He suggested that asking what happened before time began is a little like asking what lies north of the North Pole. The question feels meaningful because our language is built for a world with directions and durations, but at a certain point, the map runs out, and reality simply does not owe our grammar an answer. Stay with me here, because by the end of this video, you are going to see why that seemingly technical point might be the single most liberating idea you encounter this year, the kind of idea that quietly reorganizes how you think about death, meaning, and your own place in the story of everything. But we have to earn that revelation together, so let's start walking. Before we go further, I want to know something about you. Tell me in the comments where in the world you are watching this from right now, and tell me which C.S. Lewis book, or which single line of his, has stayed with you the longest. Maybe it was a moment in mere Christianity that cracked something open in you, or a phrase from the Great Divorce that still visits you at 3 in the morning. I read every comment, not because I have to, but because these conversations are the actual reason I make these videos, and I would rather talk with you than at you. So let's return to the question, what was before the beginning? Modern cosmology tells us the universe began around 13.8 billion years ago in an event we call the Big Bang, an expansion of space itself from an almost unimaginably dense and hot state. But here is the part that rarely makes it into the popular science summaries. The Big Bang was not an explosion happening inside space. It was the beginning of space. Time itself, according to our best physics, began at that moment, which means the question, what happened before the Big Bang, may be a category error, the same way asking what color is the number 7 is a category error. Colors do not apply to numbers. And some physicists now argue before may not apply to the beginning of time. This is where it gets strange, and where Lewis becomes surprisingly useful, because Lewis was not a scientist trying to avoid theology, and he was not a theologian trying to avoid science. He was a man who had walked through atheism, through disillusionment, through the trenches of the First World War, and out the other side into a world he did not want but could not escape. He once described his own conversion not as a triumphant discovery, but as a surrender. A man dragged reluctantly into belief, kicking against it the entire way. He wrote, and this is worth sitting with, that he was the most reluctant convert in all of England. That reluctance matters because it tells you Lewis was not looking for comfortable answers. He was looking for true ones, even when the true ones cost him something. And here is the paradox at the heart of his thinking, one that applies directly to our question about the beginning of everything. Lewis argued that human beings possess desires that nothing in this world can fully satisfy, a longing for beauty that no sunset quite completes, a hunger for justice that no court fully delivers, a yearning for home that no house ever quite becomes. He suggested provocatively that if you find in yourself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that you were made for another world. It is a strange kind of argument, an argument from longing rather than from logic, but it is worth holding on to as we ask our bigger question, because the question, what came before the universe, is, in a sense, the ultimate expression of that same longing. We want there to be a reason. We want there to be a story that makes sense of the story. We are creatures who cannot stand the idea of a universe that simply is, for no reason, with no author, with nothing behind the curtain. Let's bring in a thought experiment, because I want you to actually feel this, not just hear it. Imagine you wake up in a locked room with no windows and no doors, and on the wall is a single, perfectly ticking clock. You have no memory of how you got there. Now, someone asks you what time it was 1 hour before the clock started. If the clock only began ticking the moment the room came into existence, and if there was no time at all before that moment, the question stops making sense. It is not that the answer is hidden from you. It is that there is no answer for you to find, because the question presupposes something the situation does not contain. This is roughly the position modern physics finds itself in when we ask what came before the Big Bang, at least under many of our current models. Time, as we experience it, appears to be a feature of this universe, not a container that the universe was placed inside. But notice something important, saying that the question, what happened before time, may be malformed, does not answer the deeper question that is really underneath it. The question people actually care about, which is not really about clocks and physics at all. It is the question of why there is a universe rather than nothing. Even if time itself began at the Big Bang, we can still meaningfully ask why there is a Big Bang in the first place, why there are laws of physics at all, why existence exists rather than an eternal, echoing absence. This is where Lewis, writing decades before the phrase fine-tuning problem existed in cosmology, was already circling something remarkably similar. In Miracles, he argued that nature cannot be the whole of reality, because nature itself requires an explanation that nature cannot supply from within itself. You cannot get the rules of the game by looking only at the board. Something has to explain why there is a board, and rules, and players at all. Now, if you are enjoying this kind of exploration, thoughtful, unhurried, willing to sit in the tension between philosophy, science, and faith rather than rushing to a tidy conclusion, I would genuinely appreciate it if you hit like on this video and consider subscribing. These videos take a long time to research and write carefully, and every subscription tells me that this kind of slow, honest thinking still has an audience, which in an age of noise means more than you might think. Let's go back to Lewis's own life for a moment, because his biography gives us something the philosophy alone cannot. During the Second World War, Lewis was invited by the BBC to give a series of radio talks to a nation living, quite literally, with the possibility of annihilation every single night. Bombs were falling on English cities. Families did not know if they would see each other again by morning. And into that darkness, Lewis did not offer easy comfort. He offered reasoning, careful, patient, almost conversational reasoning about the nature of good and evil, right and wrong, and yes, ultimately, about the origins of the universe and our place within it. Those broadcasts eventually became mere Christianity. What strikes me about this history is that Lewis's most famous ideas about ultimate origins were not developed in a quiet Oxford study insulated from suffering. They were forged while death was falling from the sky. He was not offering theory. He was offering something people could hold on to while the world seemed to be ending. It is also worth remembering that Lewis did not walk this road alone. His friendship with J.R.R. Tolkien, the author of The Lord of the Rings, was central to his transformation from atheist to believer. The two men would walk together along Addison's Walk, near Magdalen College. arguing late into the night about myth, meaning, and truth. Tolkien made an argument to Lewis that reshaped how Lewis thought about origin stories themselves. The idea that the great myths of humanity, stories of dying and rising gods, of worlds beginning in fire or song or the breath of the divine, were not merely primitive nonsense to be discarded by modern minds. They were, Tolkien suggested, echoes, fragments of a truth so large that it could only reach human beings first through story, before it could reach them through history. Lewis later described this as myth becoming fact, the idea that the deepest story, the story behind all the smaller stories cultures have told about how everything began, might actually have happened, not just been imagined. I find this quietly astonishing, because it reframes the entire question we started with. Every culture in human history, without exception, has told a story about the beginning of everything. Babylonian creation myths, Norse cosmology, the opening lines of Genesis, the Hindu concept of cyclical creation and dissolution, indigenous creation stories from every continent. Why does every single human civilization, independently, across thousands of years and thousands of miles, feel compelled to answer a question that some modern thinkers dismiss as meaningless or unanswerable? Lewis would say this universality is itself evidence of something, not proof, but evidence, a signal that the question, what was before the beginning, is not a category error invented by confused primates. It might be one of the most important questions a mind can ask, precisely because we are the kind of minds built to ask it. There is a psychological dimension here too, one modern research has only recently begun to catch up with. Studies in existential psychology consistently find that human beings experience measurable distress when confronted with the idea of a universe that has no ultimate origin story, no first cause, no reason behind the reasons. Terror management theory, developed by psychologists building on the work of Ernest Becker, suggests that much of human culture, art, religion, and even ambition itself functions as a buffer against the anxiety of confronting our own contingency, the unsettling fact that we, and everything around us, did not have to exist at all. Lewis, writing decades earlier without the vocabulary of modern psychology, described something remarkably similar in The Weight of Glory, when he observed that we are far too easily satisfied creatures, fooling around with lesser things because we cannot imagine the weight of what we were actually made for. If you want to go deeper into these psychological studies and historical sources, I have gathered several of the key references and recommended readings in the description box below. So where does this leave us, if the question, what happened before the beginning, may be, in the strictest physical sense, a question about a before that never existed? Does that mean the mystery dissolves into nothing? I do not think so, and I do not think Lewis would think so either. Because underneath the technical question about time sits a deeper, more human question that no equation can fully answer. Why is there something rather than nothing? Why does existence exist? And more personally, more uncomfortably, why do you exist? Specifically you, with your particular consciousness, your particular capacity to ask this very question while sitting wherever you are sitting right now. Lewis's answer, worked out across decades of writing, was not a scientific answer, and he never pretended it was. It was a philosophical and theological claim that the universe, whatever its precise physical origin, points beyond itself, that nature is what he called a made thing, bearing the fingerprints of something that is not itself merely more nature. You do not have to accept his conclusion to appreciate the honesty of his method. He did not start from certainty and work backward to comfort. He started famously and reluctantly from doubt, and followed the argument wherever it seemed to lead, even when it led somewhere he did not initially want to go. And this brings us, finally, to the revelation I promised you at the beginning, the idea that quietly reorganizes everything else. If time itself began with the universe, then the deepest cause of the universe, whatever it is, cannot itself be another event sitting in time, waiting for its turn like the next domino in a row. It must be something outside the entire category of before and after altogether, which means the ultimate origin of everything, if there is one, is not something that happened long ago and far away. It is something that stands right now in relationship to this very moment, exactly as directly as it stood in relationship to the first moment. In other words, if there is a ground of being behind existence itself, it is not a distant ancestor of this instant. It is as present to this instant as it was to the beginning. That is the sentence I wanted you to arrive at with me, not as a proof, but as a possibility large enough to change how you experience the next few hours of your own life. Because here is what that means practically. If the origin of everything is not merely a historical fact locked 13.8 billion years in the past, but something that relates to this present moment, the same way it related to the first moment, then this moment, the one you are in right now, listening to these words, breathing this breath, is not a random, disconnected fragment drifting meaninglessly through empty time. It is, in some sense, just as close to the source of all things as the very first instant of the universe was. Lewis believed that eternity does not mean an infinitely long line of time. It means something that stands outside the line altogether, touching every point on it with equal immediacy. Which means you are not far from the beginning. You are, in the deepest sense available to a finite mind, always standing near it. We began by asking what existed before the universe began, and we end somewhere unexpected, not with a triumphant final answer, because no honest thinker offers one, but with a reframed question. That might matter more than the original. Perhaps the real question was never simply about the ancient past. Perhaps it was always about now, about whether this present moment, fragile, brief, and unrepeatable, is merely an accident drifting through indifferent time, or whether it is, as Lewis dared to suggest, a moment held intimately and directly by whatever stood at the beginning of all things. You do not need to resolve that question tonight. Very few people ever fully do. But you can carry it with you the way you would carry a lit candle through a dark house, not because it illuminates everything, but because it is enough to take the next step, and then the next. That, in the end, may be exactly what wonder was always meant to feel like. There is one more piece of this puzzle worth sitting with before we close, because it touches something Lewis returned to again and again across his writing life, the problem of pain and the mystery of a universe that contains both breathtaking beauty and unbearable suffering. If you press someone hard enough on the question of ultimate origins, sooner or later the conversation turns from cosmology to grief. People do not usually ask what happened before the beginning out of idle curiosity. They ask it after a diagnosis, after a funeral, after a war, in the quiet hours when the universe suddenly feels less like a marvel and more like an accusation. Lewis knew this pain personally. He lost his mother as a child. He fought in the trenches of the First World War, and later in life he lost his wife, Joy Davidman, to cancer, an experience so raw that he wrote about it under a pseudonym because he could not bear to publish it under his own name at first. In that later book, A Grief Observed, he confessed that his old, tidy answers about God and suffering suddenly felt thin and inadequate in the face of real loss. And yet, remarkably, he did not abandon the search for meaning. He revised it, deepened it, let it become more honest rather than less hopeful. That, perhaps, is the real lesson underneath all of this. The question of what stands behind the universe is never merely academic. It is the same question hiding inside every hospital waiting room, every late-night phone call, every moment when we look up at an indifferent sky and ask whether anyone or anything is actually listening. So here is my question for you, the one I would love to read your thoughts on in the comments below. If time itself began with the universe, and the source of all things stands as close to this very moment as it did to the first one, does that change how you think about your own life right now? Today, I would love to know, and if this exploration of C.S. Lewis' philosophy, faith, and the mystery at the edge of existence meant something to you. Please subscribe so we can keep asking these questions together, one honest conversation at a time.